In July 1940, Britain launched an assault on the French fleet stationed at Mers el-Kebir. This shocking action resulted in the death of over 1,000 French sailors, all in a bid to prevent those ships from falling into Adolf Hitler's hands. As France sought an armistice, Hitler devised his retribution at Compiègne, dividing the nation while deliberately sparing the French fleet and colonies to create a divide between Paris and London, leading to the formation of Vichy France. Meanwhile, Japan advanced into Indochina, tightening its grip on China. Fearing that the fleet could come under Axis control, Winston Churchill ordered Operation Catapult, which sent shockwaves worldwide and forced difficult decisions for Charles de Gaulle. We then follow Hitler's next steps: Directive 16 and the strategy for Operation Sea Lion, Hermann Göring's attempt to decimate Fighter Command, and the fierce Battle of Britain, which spanned from Kanalkampf and Adlertag to the Blitz. Throughout this period, radar technology, increased production, and foreign pilots helped to mitigate the attacks, leading to a shift in focus towards bombing urban areas. Finally, we expand our view to the Mediterranean and the Balkans. Mussolini's ambitious moves in Egypt and Greece, the nighttime raid at Taranto, and the British responses that cripple Italian military efforts. By the conclusion, we understand why the invasion is delayed, why Hitler's attention turns eastward, and how the European conflict starts to evolve into a global war. On June 18, 1940, Adolf Hitler met with Benito Mussolini in Munich to discuss the armistice terms with France. To Mussolini's disappointment, Hitler decided against imposing harsh conditions, preventing Italy from seizing the French fleet or their colonies. There would be no Italian representatives present at the armistice ceremony. In Tokyo, Japan quickly acted on France's defeat. The Japanese government warned Marshal Philippe Pétain's administration that any supply routes to Chinese nationalist forces via Indochina must be cut off immediately, with an invasion of the French territory anticipated at any moment. Under pressure, the French Governor-General permitted Japanese troops and aircraft to be stationed in Tonkin, near Hanoi. By June 21st, preparations for the armistice were finalized. Having long anticipated this moment, Hitler commanded that Marshal Ferdinand Foch's railway carriage, where German representatives had signed the 1918 surrender, be returned from its museum to the forest of Compiègne. The moment of humiliation that had haunted him was about to be avenged. Hitler took his seat in the carriage alongside Joachim von Ribbentrop, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, Hermann Göring, Erich Raeder, Franz Halder, and General Oberst Wilhelm Keitel as they awaited General Hunziker's delegation. Otto Günsche, an orderly for Adolf Hitler, carried a pistol with him to protect the Führer from any potential threats posed by the French delegates. While Wilhelm Keitel read the armistice terms, Hitler stayed quiet. Afterward, he left and called Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels recorded in his diary, "The disgrace is now extinguished. It is a feeling of being born again." General Hunziker learned that the German army would occupy the northern part of France and the Atlantic coast, while Marshal Pétain's government would control the remaining 2/5 of the country, allowed to maintain an army of 100,000 soldiers. France was required to bear the expenses of the German occupation, with the Reichsmark set at an outrageously favorable rate against the French franc. However, Germany would not interfere with France's navy or its colonies. As Hitler had anticipated, these 2 points were non-negotiable for both Pétain and General Weygand. His aim was to separate the French from the British and prevent them from surrendering their fleet to their previous ally. The German Navy, which was eager to gain control of the French Navy to continue fighting against Britain, faced disappointment. Following Weygand's orders, General Hunziker felt a profound unease after signing the armistice. "If Great Britain is not brought to its knees in 3 months," he reportedly said, "then we are the greatest criminals in history." The armistice officially began in the early hours of June 25th. Hitler made a proclamation celebrating the most glorious victory of all time. Bells were to ring in Germany for a week, and flags were to be displayed for 10 days. On the morning of June 28th, Hitler toured Paris accompanied by the sculptor Arno Breker and architects Albert Speer and Hermann Giesler. Ironically, they were escorted by General Major Hans Speidel, who would become a key conspirator against him in France 4 years later. Hitler was unimpressed by Paris, believing his envisioned capital of Germania in Berlin would be far more magnificent. He returned to Germany to plan his grand return to Berlin and contemplated a proposal to Britain which would be presented to the Reichstag. However, he was troubled by the Soviet Union's takeover of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina from Romania on June 28th, as Joseph Stalin's ambitions in the area could threaten the Danube Delta and the crucial oil fields of Ploesti, both essential to German interests. 3 days later, the Romanian government withdrew its acceptance of the Anglo-French guarantee of its borders and sent representatives to Berlin. The Axis was on the verge of gaining another ally. Meanwhile, Winston Churchill, resolute in his commitment to continue the fight, faced a difficult choice. He seemed to regret his telegram to Franklin Roosevelt on May 21st, in which he reflected on the possibility of British defeat and the loss of the Royal Navy. Now he needed a statement to both the United States and the world that would reveal a fierce determination to resist. The looming threat of the French fleet falling into German hands continued to worry him deeply, prompting him to take decisive action. His requests to the new French government, urging them to send their warships to British ports, had gone unanswered. Admiral Darlan's previous assurances lost their credibility after he secretly aligned himself with the capitulators. Hitler's guarantee in the armistice terms could just as easily be ignored like all his prior commitments. The French fleet would be invaluable to the Germans in a potential invasion of Britain, particularly after the losses suffered by the Kriegsmarine off the coast of Norway. With Italy now at war, the Royal Navy's dominance of the Mediterranean was at risk. Neutralizing the formidable French naval force was bound to be an extraordinarily challenging endeavor. Churchill communicated to Admiral Sir James Somerville, as his Force H departed from Gibraltar the previous night, that he had been assigned one of the most unpleasant and challenging tasks a British admiral could encounter. Somerville, like many officers in the Royal Navy, was staunchly against using force against an Allied navy with which he had collaborated closely. He sought clarification regarding his orders for Operation Catapult in a message to the Admiralty, only to be met with very clear directives. The French could either ally with the British to continue fighting against Germany and Italy, sail to a British port, head to a French port in the West Indies, such as Martinique, or travel to the United States, or sink their ships themselves within 6 hours. If they refused all options, he had the explicit orders of His Majesty's government to use whatever force was necessary to prevent their vessels from falling into German or Italian hands. Just before dawn on Wednesday, July 3rd, the British forces initiated their plan. French warships gathered in southern British ports were seized by armed boarding parties, resulting in only a few casualties. In Alexandria, a more refined plan was put in place by Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham to blockade the French squadron in the harbor. The significant tragedy was set to unfold at the French North African port of Mers el Kebir, close to Oran, once the base for the Barbary Coast pirates. At dawn, the destroyer HMS Foxhound appeared off the harbor, and when the morning fog began to lift, Captain Cedric Holland, a representative of Somerville, signaled his desire to confer. Admiral Marcel Gensoul, aboard his flagship Dunkirk, commanded the battlecruisers Strasbourg, Bretagne, and Provence, along with a small group of fast fleet destroyers. Gensoul declined to meet with Holland, forcing him to attempt negotiations through the gunnery officer of the Dunkirk, whom he knew well. Gensoul asserted that the French Navy would never permit its ships to fall into the hands of the Germans or the Italians. He warned that if the British continued their threats, his squadron would respond with force. Since Gensoul still refused to meet Holland face to face, he relayed a written ultimatum outlining the options available. The idea of sailing to Martinique or the United States, which Admiral Darlan had even considered, is rarely discussed in French accounts of this event. Perhaps this is because Gensoul did not mention it when signaling to Darlan. As the weather grew increasingly hot, Holland continued to push for dialogue, but Gensoul remained firm in his stance. As the deadline of 3 o'clock approached, Somerville ordered Swordfish aircraft from the Ark Royal to deploy magnetic mines across the entrance of the harbor. He hoped this would convince Gensoul that he was serious. Gensoul eventually agreed to meet Holland in person, and the deadline was pushed to 5:30. The French were stalling, but Somerville, uncomfortable with the situation, was willing to take that chance. As Holland boarded the Dunkirk, he likely reflected on the unfortunate coincidence of its name, noticing that the French vessels were now at battle stations, with tugs ready to pull the 4 battleships away from the jetty. Gensoul cautioned Holland that opening fire would be equivalent to a declaration of war. He stated he would scuttle his ships only if the Germans attempted to seize them. However, Somerville was under pressure from the Admiralty to resolve the matter swiftly, especially as wireless intercepts indicated a French cruiser squadron was en route from Algiers. He signaled to Gensoul, insisting that if he did not agree to one of the options immediately, he would open fire at 5:30 p.m. as planned. Holland had to depart quickly. Somerville waited nearly another half hour past the delayed deadline, hoping for a change of heart. At 5:54 p.m., the battlecruiser HMS Hood and the battleships Valiant and Resolution began firing their 15-inch main guns. They quickly found their mark. The Dunkirk and the Provence suffered severe damage, while the Bretagne exploded and capsized. Other ships remained remarkably unscathed, but Somerville halted fire to give Gensoul another opportunity. He did not realize that the Strasbourg and 2 out of 3 fleet destroyers, concealed by thick smoke, had successfully reached open water. When a spotter plane alerted the flagship of their escape, Somerville dismissed the information, believing the mines would have prevented it. Eventually, the Hood pursued, and Swordfish and Skuas were launched from the Ark Royal, but their attacks failed when faced with French fighters scrambled from Oran airfield. By that time, night was swiftly approaching the North African coast. The devastation aboard the damaged ships in Mers el-Kebir was horrific, particularly for those trapped in engine rooms. Many suffocated from the smoke. In total, 1,097 French sailors lost their lives and another 350 were injured. Most of the casualties came from the Bretagne. The Royal Navy justifiably viewed Operation Catapult as the most disgraceful duty it had ever undertaken. However, this one-sided battle had a profound impact worldwide, showing that Britain was willing to fight as fiercely as necessary. Franklin D. Roosevelt, in particular, became convinced that Britain would not surrender. In the House of Commons, Winston Churchill received cheers for similar reasons, not out of animosity towards the French for seeking an armistice. The growing anti-British sentiment from Petain's administration, which had troubled American diplomats, turned into deep animosity after Mers el-Kebir. Yet, Pétain and Weygand recognized that declaring war would bring no advantage. They simply severed diplomatic ties. For Charles de Gaulle, this was an incredibly challenging time. Very few French sailors and soldiers in Britain were willing to join his fledgling forces, which initially numbered only a few hundred. The homesick majority sought repatriation instead. Hitler was compelled to contemplate these recent developments as plans for his grand arrival in Berlin were underway. He had intended to extend a peace offer to Britain shortly after his return, but now his confidence had waned. Many Germans, who had feared another devastating conflict in Flanders and Champagne, were ecstatic about this remarkable victory. They believed this time that the war was nearing its conclusion. Like those who had surrendered in France, they thought Britain could never withstand the pressure alone. A faction seeking peace would soon replace Churchill. On Saturday, July 6th, young girls from the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the female counterpart of the Hitler Youth, scattered flowers along the route from the Anhalter Bahnhof, the station where the Führer's train would arrive, to the Reichschancellery. Crowds began to gather 6 hours ahead of his arrival. The level of excitement was extraordinary, especially considering the relatively subdued response in Berlin to the news of German troops occupying Paris. It far exceeded the enthusiasm following the annexation of Austria. Even individuals opposed to the regime got swept up in the euphoric celebrations of victory, driven this time by a strong animosity toward Britain, the last barrier to establishing a German peace across Europe. Hitler's Roman-style triumph was missing only the captives in chains and the whispering slave reminding him of his mortality. The day was sunny for his arrival, seemingly reinforcing the phenomenon of Führer weather that marked significant occasions of the Third Reich. The streets were filled with thousands cheering, screaming, and in a state of frenzy. After Hitler's convoy of six-wheeled Mercedes reached the Reichskanzlei, the deafening cheers from the Bund Deutscher Mädel blended with the roars of the crowd calling for their Führer to appear on the balcony. Just days later, Hitler made a crucial decision. After considering various strategies against Britain and discussing a potential invasion with his top commanders, he issued Directive No. 16 for preparations of a landing operation against England. The initial plans for an invasion, known as Studie Nordwest, had been completed the previous December. However, even prior to the losses suffered by the Navy during the Norwegian campaign, Gross Admiral Raeder had insisted that an invasion could only proceed after the Air Force secured air superiority. Halder advocated for the Army that an invasion should be considered only as a last resort. The Kriegsmarine faced the daunting challenge of gathering enough ships and vessels to transport the initial wave of 100,000 soldiers, along with tanks, vehicles, and equipment across the English Channel. It also had to account for its clear disadvantage in warships compared to the Royal Navy. Initially, the Oberkommando des Heeres allocated the 6th, 9th, and 16th Armies, stationed along the Channel coast from the Cherbourg Peninsula to Ostend, to the invasion force. This was later scaled back to just the 9th and 16th Armies landing between Worthing and Folkestone, totaling around 150,000 troops. Disputes among the military branches over the overwhelming challenges made the operation appear increasingly unlikely before the unpredictable autumn weather set in. The only faction within the Nazi regime that seemed to take the invasion of Britain seriously was Himmler's Reich Security Head Administration, which included the Gestapo and the Security Service. Its counter-espionage division, under the leadership of Walter Schellenberg, created an astonishingly detailed, yet sometimes humorously inaccurate, report on Great Britain containing a special search list of 2,820 individuals whom the Gestapo planned to apprehend after the invasion. Hitler exercised caution for additional reasons. He feared that the collapse of the British Empire could lead to the United States, Japan, and the Soviet Union seizing its territories. He decided that Operation Sealion would only proceed if Göring, who had been elevated to the rank of Reichsmarschall, could force Britain into submission with the Luftwaffe. Consequently, the invasion of Britain was never regarded with urgency by the highest authorities. The Luftwaffe was not yet prepared. Göring had anticipated that the British would seek peace following the defeat of France, leading his Air Force units to require more time to reassemble and equip their squadrons. German losses in the Low Countries and France were significantly greater than expected, with 1,284 of its aircraft destroyed, compared to 931 lost by the Royal Air Force. Furthermore, redeploying fighter and bomber units to airfields in northern France took longer than planned. Throughout early July, the Luftwaffe concentrated solely on shipping in the English Channel, the Thames Estuary, and the North Sea, a campaign they referred to as the Channel Battle. Attacks primarily from Stuka dive bombers and swift motor torpedo boats, which the British referred to as E-boats, effectively shut down the English Channel to British supply ships. On July 19th, Adolf Hitler delivered an extensive address to the Reichstag members and his generals, who had gathered with great ceremony at the Kroll Opera House. After praising his commanders and celebrating Germany's military successes, he turned his focus to England, denouncing Winston Churchill as a warmonger and extending an appeal to reason, which the British government promptly rejected. He completely misjudged that Churchill's position had now solidified as the embodiment of unwavering resolve. Hitler's frustration intensified following his victory in the railway carriage at Forêt de Compiègne and the significant boost in German power. The occupation of northern and western France by the Wehrmacht provided land access to Spain's raw materials and naval bases along the Atlantic coast. Alsace, Lorraine, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, and Eupen-Malmedy in eastern Belgium were incorporated into the Reich. The Italians occupied a portion of southeastern France, while the remainder of south-central France, designated as the unoccupied zone, was left under the control of Marshal Philippe Pétain's French state, based in the spa town of Vichy. On July 10th, just a week after the incident at Mers-el-Kébir, the Assemblée Nationale convened in Vichy's Grand Casino. They granted full powers to Marshal Pétain, with only 80 out of 649 members opposing the measure. The Third Republic came to an end. The État français, which claimed to embody traditional values of work, family, and country, fostered a climate of moral and political suffocation that was both xenophobic and oppressive. It never acknowledged its role in aiding Nazi Germany by policing unoccupied France for German interests. France was required to cover not only the costs of its occupation, but also 1/5 of the expenses stemming from Germany's war efforts up to that point. The inflated assessments and the exchange rate for the Reichsmark set by Berlin were unchallengeable. This arrangement proved to be a substantial benefit for the occupation forces. One soldier noted, "There's a lot to be purchased with our money, and plenty of pfennig are being spent. We are stationed in a large village, and the shops are almost empty now." Those in Paris were thoroughly stripped, especially by officers on leave. Additionally, the Nazi government was able to confiscate any raw material reserves it required for its war industries. The military assets seized, including weapons, vehicles, and horses, would significantly support the needs of the German army for their invasion of the Soviet Union the following year. Meanwhile, French industry adapted to cater to the demands of their conquerors, and French agriculture enabled the Germans to experience an improved standard of living compared to the years before the First World War. The daily meat, fat, and sugar rations for the French had to be cut to about half of what the Germans received. The Germans considered this a justified retribution for the hunger they faced in the aftermath of the First World War. Conversely, the French clung to the hope that once Britain reached an agreement, a peace settlement would enhance conditions for all. Following the evacuation at Dunkirk and the French surrender, the British found themselves in a state of shock, akin to a wounded soldier who feels no pain. They understood the dire situation, almost catastrophic, as nearly all their army's weapons and vehicles were left behind across the English Channel. Yet, buoyed by Churchill's reassuring words, they almost embraced the harsh reality of their predicament. A self-soothing belief took hold that, while the British often struggled at the outset of a war, they would eventually emerge victorious in the final battle, despite having no clear plan on how to achieve that. Many, including the king, expressed a sense of relief at no longer having to rely on the French as allies. Air Chief Marshal Dowding later claimed that upon learning of the French surrender, he knelt in gratitude that no more fighter planes would need to be risked over the Channel. The British anticipated that after conquering France, the Germans would swiftly proceed with an invasion. General Sir Alan Brooke, now responsible for defending the southern coastline, was particularly worried about the shortages of weapons, armored vehicles, and trained troops. The military leaders remained deeply concerned about the threat to aircraft factories, which were critical for the Royal Air Force to replace the planes lost in France. However, the time the Luftwaffe needed to prepare for its assault on Britain provided an essential period of readiness. Though the British possessed only 700 fighters at that moment, the Germans underestimated their opponent's ability to produce 470 fighters each month, which was double the rate of Germany's armaments industry. The Luftwaffe also confidently believed that its pilots and aircraft were clearly superior. The Royal Air Force had lost 136 pilots, either killed or captured in France. Even with support from other nationalities, they were still lacking in numbers. Flight training schools were doing their best to train as many pilots as possible, but newly qualified pilots were often the first to be shot down. The Polish made up the largest foreign group, with over 8,000 Air Force personnel. They were unique in having combat experience, but their integration into the Royal Air Force was a slow process. Negotiations with General Sikorski, who sought an independent Polish Air Force, proved to be difficult. However, once the initial groups of pilots joined the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, their skills quickly shone through. British pilots often referred to the "crazy Poles" due to their courage and disregard for authority. Their new comrades soon expressed their frustrations with the bureaucracy of the Royal Air Force, although they conceded it was an improvement compared to the French Air Force. Discipline was frequently an issue, partly because the Polish pilots harbored resentment towards their own commanders for how their air force had been handled during the German invasion the previous September. They had anticipated engaging the Luftwaffe with fierce determination, believing that even though their P-11 planes were slow and poorly armed, they would triumph through skill and bravery. Instead, they had been overwhelmed by the numerical and technological superiority of the German air forces. That painful experience, along with the horrific treatment of their nation by Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, fueled a strong desire for vengeance now that they were equipped with modern fighters. Senior Royal Air Force officers were gravely mistaken when they assumed the Poles had been demoralized by their defeat and sought to assign them to bomber squadrons. The differences in British culture, manners, and food came as a shock to the Polish. Few could forget the fish paste sandwiches offered to them upon their arrival in England, and British cuisine made them even more nostalgic for home, from overcooked mutton and cabbage to the ever-present custard, which also horrified the Free French. Yet, the warm welcome from many Britons who greeted them with exclamations of "Long live Poland" truly astonished them. Polish pilots, viewed as daring and heroic, found themselves enthusiastically approached by young British women expressing newfound freedoms. Communicating on the dance floor was less challenging than in the air. The reputation of Polish pilots for reckless bravery was not entirely accurate. In reality, their casualty rates were lower than those of Royal Air Force pilots, due in part to their experience and their skill in watching for ambushes by German fighters. They were distinctly individualistic and had little regard for the Royal Air Force's outdated tactics of flying in tight formations, known as V-shaped formations of three. It took time, along with many unnecessary losses, before the Royal Air Force adopted the German approach learned from the Spanish Civil War of flying in double pairs, referred to as finger four. By July 10th, there were 40 Polish pilots serving in Royal Air Force Fighter Command squadrons, and that number steadily increased as more of their men from France became qualified. As the Battle of Britain reached its peak, over 10% of the fighter pilots in the southeast were Polish. On July 13th, the first Polish squadron was established. Within a month, the British government agreed to General Władysław Sikorski's request for a Polish Air Force, including its own fighter and bomber squadrons, but remaining under Royal Air Force command. On July 31st, Adolf Hitler summoned his generals to the Berghof above Berchtesgaden. He remained puzzled by Britain's refusal to negotiate. With little chance of the United States entering the war in the near future, he sensed that Winston Churchill was relying on the Soviet Union. This was a significant factor in his decision to proceed with his ultimate goal of destroying Jewish Bolshevism in the East. He believed that only by defeating Soviet power through a massive invasion could Britain be forced to yield. Thus, Churchill's resolve in late May to continue fighting alone had far-reaching implications beyond just the fate of the British Isles. With Russia defeated, Hitler told his top commanders, Britain's last hope will be broken. Germany will then dominate Europe and the Balkans. This time, unlike the anxiety shown before the invasion of France, his generals exhibited remarkable determination when confronted with the idea of attacking the Soviet Union. Without a direct command from Hitler, General Franz Halder had instructed staff officers to explore preliminary plans. In the wake of their victory over France and the total reversal of the humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles, the Wehrmacht commanders-in-chief regarded the Führer as the first soldier of the Reich who would secure Germany's future indefinitely. 2 weeks later, Hitler, privately skeptical of how easily he could win over his top commanders with honors, medals, and money, presented 12 field marshal batons to those who had conquered France. Yet before turning his attention to the Soviet Union, which he believed would be easy to defeat after France's fall, he felt it necessary to address Britain to avoid a war on two fronts. The directive from the OKW ordered the Luftwaffe to focus on destroying the Royal Air Force its ground support structure, and the British arms industry, along with ports and warships. Hermann Goering predicted this destruction would take less than a month. With spirits high from the victory in France and their numerical advantage, the Luftwaffe stationed in France had 656 Messerschmitt 109 fighters, 168 Me 110 twin-engine fighters, 769 Dornier, Heinkel, and Junkers 88 bombers, and 316 Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. In defense of the British Isles, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had only 504 Hurricanes and Spitfires. Before the main assault began in early August, the 2 Fliegerkorps in northern France focused on gathering intelligence on RAF airfields, conducting probing raids to draw British fighters into the air and exhaust them before the real battle commenced, while also attacking coastal radar stations. Thanks to the radar stations alongside the Observer Corps and robust communication from command centers, the RAF could avoid wasting flight time on patrols over the English Channel. In theory, squadrons could be scrambled in time to gain altitude while conserving fuel for longer combat effectiveness. Fortunately for the British, the radar towers proved challenging to hit, and even when damaged, they were quickly restored. Dowding had withheld the Spitfire squadrons during the conflict over France, except during the evacuation from Dunkirk. He conserved his forces, understanding what the German strategies implied. Dowding, who seemed distant and sorrowful after his wife's passing in 1920, held a quiet passion for his dear fighter boys, earning their devoted loyalty. He had a clear sense of the challenges ahead and ensured that the right leader was in charge of 11 Group, tasked with defending London and the southeastern region of England. Air Marshal Keith Park, a New Zealander, had previously shot down 20 German aircraft during the First World War. Like Dowding, he was open to hearing his pilots and allowed them to set aside outdated pre-war tactics to create their own strategies. During that pivotal summer, Fighter Command transformed into an international air force. Among the 2,917 aircrew who participated in the Battle of Britain, only 2,334 were from Britain. The remainder included 145 Polish pilots, 126 from New Zealand, 98 Canadians, 88 Czechs, 33 Australians, 29 Belgians, 25 South Africans, 13 French, 11 Americans, 10 Irish, and several others from different nationalities. The first major confrontation occurred before the formal launch of the German air campaign. On July 24th, Adolf Galland led a group of 40 Messerschmitt 109s and 18 Dornier 17 bombers in an attack on a convoy in the Thames estuary. Spitfires from 3 squadrons ascended to engage them. While they only managed to down 2 German aircraft instead of the claimed 16, Galland was unsettled by the resolve of the outnumbered British pilots. He reprimanded his own crew upon their return for their hesitation to engage the Spitfires and began to doubt that the upcoming battle would be as straightforward as the Reichsmarschall had anticipated. In typical German fashion, the offensive was codenamed Eagle Attack, and Eagle Day was eventually scheduled for August 13th after several delays. Following some confusion concerning weather forecasts, formations of German bombers and fighters launched. The largest group was designated to strike the naval base at Portsmouth, while others targeted Royal Air Force airfields. Despite their extensive reconnaissance, Luftwaffe intelligence was flawed. They primarily attacked secondary airfields or bases that were not part of Fighter Command. As the sky cleared in the afternoon, radar stations along the south coast detected around 300 aircraft approaching Southampton. 80 fighters were scrambled, an unprecedented number compared to previous weeks. Squadron 609 successfully engaged a cluster of Stukas, shooting down 6. Overall, the Royal Air Force fighters claimed 47 enemy aircraft while losing 13 of their own, resulting in 3 pilots killed. However, the German losses were significantly higher, with 89 killed or captured. The English Channel now provided an advantage for the Royal Air Force. During the battle for France, pilots of damaged aircraft returning home feared having to ditch or crash land in the water. Now the Germans faced a greater peril, coupled with the certainty of imprisonment if they had to bail out over England. Goering, feeling the sting of the unsatisfactory outcome from Adlertag, initiated an even more extensive assault on August 15th, deploying 1,790 fighters and bombers from Norway, Denmark, and northern France. The units from the 5th Luftwaffe in Scandinavia sustained nearly 20% losses and were not returned to combat due to the severity of their casualties. The Luftwaffe labeled that day as Black Thursday, though the Royal Air Force could hardly celebrate. They also faced significant losses, and the Luftwaffe, with its sheer numerical advantage, continued to relentlessly press on. Constant bombardments of airfields resulted in casualties among fitters, riggers, orderlies, and even drivers and plotters of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. On August 18th, 43 Squadron took a measure of revenge when their fighters descended on a group of Stukas engaging a radar station, downing 18 of these vulnerable aircraft before their escorting Messerschmitt 109s joined the combat. Fresh pilot officers arriving as reinforcements were eager to hear from those who had already been in action. They quickly fell into the routine, waking before dawn with a cup of tea brought by their Batman, being driven to dispersal for breakfast, and then waiting as the sun rose. Unfortunately for Fighter Command, the weather during much of August and September was ideal for the Luftwaffe, featuring clear blue skies. The waiting period was the most difficult. That was when pilots experienced dry mouths and the metallic taste of fear. Then they would hear the ominous sound of the field telephone ringing, followed by the command to squadron scramble. They would race to their aircraft, parachutes bouncing against their backs. Ground crew members would assist them in climbing into the cockpit, where they would conduct safety checks. Once their Merlin engines roared to life, chocks were removed, and the pilots taxied their fighters into position for takeoff, with too many thoughts racing through their minds to feel fear, at least for that brief moment. Once in the air, with engines straining to gain altitude, the newcomers had to remember to constantly scan their surroundings. They quickly learned that the more seasoned pilots did not wear silk scarves merely for style. With heads swiveling to watch for threats, their necks chafed against regulation collars and ties. They had been drilled to keep their eyes skinned at all times. Assuming they made it through their first encounter, and many did not, they returned to base to wait again, eating corned beef sandwiches washed down with mugs of tea while their planes were refueled and rearmed. Most fell asleep immediately from exhaustion on the ground or in deck chairs. Once back in the air, the sector controllers directed them toward a formation of enemy aircraft. A shout of "Tally-ho!" over the radio indicated that another squadron member had spotted a group of black dots. The pilot would activate the reflector sight, and the tension began to rise. It was crucial to keep fear in check, as losing control could lead to rapid demise. The main goal was to disrupt the bombers before the escorting Me-109s could engage. If multiple squadrons were directed toward the enemy force, the quicker Spitfires would tackle the enemy fighters, while the Hurricanes focused on the bombers. Within seconds, the sky erupted into chaos, with twisting, diving aircraft competing for position to unleash a quick burst of gunfire, all while remembering to keep an eye on what was behind them. A fixated focus on the target could allow an enemy fighter to sneak in behind without being noticed. Some novice pilots, when fired upon for the first time, experienced a feeling of paralysis. If they did not shake off that frozen state, it would be the end. If the engine was hit, glycol or oil would stream back and coat the windscreen. The worst fear was the fire spreading toward the cockpit. The intense heat could jam the cockpit hood, but once the pilot forced it open and released the harness straps, he needed to roll his aircraft upside down to drop clear. Many were so disoriented by the experience that they had to consciously remember to pull the ripcord. If they glanced around on the way down, they often saw that the sky, which had seemed buzzing with aircraft, was suddenly empty, leaving them alone. Provided they were not over the English Channel, Royal Air Force pilots at least knew they were landing on home ground. The Polish and Czech pilots were aware that, irrespective of their uniforms, locals or members of the Home Guard could mistakenly identify them as Germans. The parachute of one Polish pilot, Czesław Tarkowski, snagged in an oak tree. People with pitchforks and staves ran up, he recounted. One of them, armed with a shotgun, was shouting, "Hands up!" "Leave me alone," I replied in my best English. The the somber expressions quickly turned bright. "He's one of ours," they cheered together. One afternoon, another Polish pilot arrived at a respectable lawn tennis club. He was signed in as a guest, handed a racket, lent some white trousers, and invited to take part in a match. His opponents were thoroughly defeated and left entirely drained by the time a Royal Air Force vehicle came to retrieve him. The honest pilot would confess to feeling a fierce, raw joy when he saw the enemy plane he had hit going down. Polish pilots, instructed by the British not to shoot German pilots who parachuted out, sometimes resorted to flying over their parachute canopies so they would collapse in the slipstream, causing their enemy to fall to their demise. Others experienced a moment of compassion, remembering that they were killing or injuring a person, not just destroying an aircraft. The combination of exhaustion and fear created dangerously high levels of stress. Many suffered from dreadful nightmares each night. Inevitably, some broke under the pressure. Almost everyone experienced nervousness at some point, but pushed themselves to keep going. However, a few turned away from combat, pretending they had engine problems. After a few incidents, this behavior was noticed. In official Royal Air Force terms, it was labeled as a lack of moral fiber, leading to the pilot being reassigned to less demanding duties. Most British fighter pilots were under the age of 22. They had no choice but to mature quickly, even while the boisterous nicknames and camaraderie in the mess baffled fellow pilots from other nations. But as Luftwaffe attacks on Britain escalated, with civilian casualties rising, a feeling of angry indignation grew. German fighter pilots were also experiencing stress and exhaustion. Operating from makeshift and uneven airstrips in the Pas-de-Calais, they faced numerous accidents. The Messerschmitt 109 was an outstanding aircraft for skilled pilots, but for those rushed in from flight school, it proved challenging to control. Unlike Hugh Dowding, who rotated his squadrons to ensure they rested in quieter areas, Hermann Göring showed no mercy toward his aircrews, whose morale began to decline amid increasing losses. The bomber squadrons voiced their frustration about the Me-109s leaving them vulnerable, but the reality was that the fighters did not have enough fuel to stay over England longer than 30 minutes, especially during intense dogfights. Meanwhile, the pilots flying the Me-110 twin-engined fighters were feeling disheartened by their losses and wished for the Me-109s to provide them with escort. British pilots, demonstrating extraordinary bravery, found that direct attacks were the most effective strategy against the Me-110s. Even a furious Hermann Göring had to pull the Stuka dive bombers from significant operations after the devastating events on August 18th. However, Göring, driven by overly optimistic reports from his chief intelligence officer, believed that the Royal Air Force was on the brink of collapse. He mandated intensified assaults on airfields. His own pilots grew disheartened by the constant assertion that the Royal Air Force was near its end, especially when they encountered fierce resistance on every mission. Dowding had anticipated this grinding battle, and the increasing damage to airfields was a significant concern. Although the Royal Air Force shot down more German aircraft than it lost almost daily, it operated from a considerably smaller base. An impressive boost in fighter production alleviated some worries, but pilot losses remained Dowding's primary concern. His men were so exhausted that they were dozing off at meals and even mid-conversation. To minimize casualties, fighter squadrons were instructed not to chase German raiders over the channel and to refrain from responding to strafing runs by small groups of Messerschmitts. Fighter Command also faced disagreements regarding tactics. Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, the head of 10 Group north of London, supported the big wing strategy, which involved mobilizing multiple squadrons. This idea had first been promoted by Wing Commander Douglas Bader, a brave but stubborn officer known for returning to duty as a fighter pilot after losing both legs in a pre-war accident. However, both Keith Park and Dowding were deeply unsatisfied with the big wing method. By the time 10 Group managed to gather one of these formations in the air, the German raiders had typically departed. On the night of August 24th, over 100 German bombers accidentally bombed eastern and central London, having missed their intended targets. This incident prompted Winston Churchill to authorize a series of retaliatory bombing raids on Germany. The implications for the people of London were severe, but they also played a role in Goering's critical choice to shift focus away from airfields. This action ultimately protected the Royal Air Force Fighter Command at a pivotal moment in the battle. Under increasing pressure from Goering, German strikes ramped up significantly toward the end of August and into the first week of September. On one single day, Fighter Command suffered the loss of 40 aircraft, with 9 pilots killed and 18 others seriously injured. The strain was felt by everyone, but the understanding that the battle was truly a fight to the finish, combined with the knowledge that Fighter Command was causing greater losses to the Luftwaffe, strengthened the pilots' determination. On the afternoon of September 7th, while Goering observed from the cliffs of Pas-de-Calais, the Luftwaffe launched a massive assault with over 1,000 aircraft. Fighter Command promptly deployed 11 squadrons of fighters. Throughout Kent, farm workers, land girls, and local residents strained to follow the vapor trails as the engagement unfolded. It was difficult to tell which fighters belonged to which side, but each time a bomber fell from the sky, plumes of smoke trailing behind it, cheers erupted. Most of the bomber squadrons aimed for the docks in London, marking Hitler's response to the attacks by Bomber Command on Germany. The smoke from the raging fires ignited by incendiary bombs led subsequent waves of bombers to their targets. London faced its first of many severe assaults, with over 300 civilians killed and 1,300 wounded. However, Goering's assumption that Fighter Command was exhausted, coupled with the shift to targeting cities primarily at night, signified the Luftwaffe's failure to win the battle. Yet the British remained on edge, anticipating the tolling of church bells that would signal an invasion. Bomber Command persisted in targeting the barges gathered at ports in the Channel. No one was aware of Hitler's own uncertainties. If the Royal Air Force was not decimated by mid-September, then Operation Ceylon would be delayed. Understanding that he would bear the blame for failing to defeat the Royal Air Force, as he had confidently claimed he would, Goering ordered another significant assault for Sunday, September 15th. That day, Winston Churchill opted to the headquarters of the 11 Group at Uxbridge, where he stood in the control room beside Park, eagerly watching as the data from the radar stations and the observer corps was translated into symbols representing German raiders on the plotting board below. By midday, Park, trusting his gut that this was a major offensive, had deployed 23 squadrons of fighters. This time, the Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons had ample warning to gain altitude. When the escorting Messerschmitt 109s had to turn back due to fuel shortages, the bombers found themselves significantly outnumbered by the fighters of an air force they had believed was defeated. This pattern continued throughout the afternoon, with Park calling for additional reinforcements from 10 Group and 12 Group in Western England. By the day's end, the Royal Air Force had destroyed 56 aircraft while losing 29 fighters and 12 pilots. A few days later, more attacks occurred, but none matched this intensity. Yet on the 16th of September, Hermann Goering was convinced by his overly optimistic chief intelligence officer that Fighter Command had plummeted to 177 aircraft. The fear of invasion remained, but Adolf Hitler opted to delay Operation Ceylon until further notice. The Kriegsmarine and the German Army High Command were even less eager to invade now that the Luftwaffe's failure to obliterate Fighter Command had become evident. With the conflict in the West nearing a stalemate, signs of it evolving into a global war began to surface. The Japanese were recently stunned by communist forces in northern China launching a series of assaults. The Sino-Japanese War reignited with another wave of fierce fighting. On the 27th of September, the Japanese signed a tripartite pact in Berlin, clearly directed at the United States. President Franklin D. Roosevelt quickly summoned his military advisors to consider the ramifications, and 2 days later, Great Britain reopened the Burma Road to transport war materials to the Chinese nationalists. The Battle of Britain was considered to have concluded by the end of October, when the Luftwaffe shifted its focus to night bombings of London and industrial targets in the Midlands. Considering the figures for August and September, the heart of the battle, the Royal Air Force lost 723 aircraft, while the Luftwaffe suffered over 2,000 losses. A notably high percentage resulted not from enemy action, but from special circumstances, primarily accidents. In October, the Royal Air Force shot down 206 German fighters and bombers, although the total loss for the Luftwaffe that month was 375. The so-called Blitz on London and other cities persisted throughout the winter. On the 13th of November, the Royal Air Force Bomber Command retaliated against Berlin under Churchill's orders. The Soviet Foreign Minister, Molotov, had come for discussions the day before, which made Stalin apprehensive about German troops in Finland and Nazi influence in the Balkans. Stalin was also seeking assurances from Germany regarding Soviet shipping rights from the Black Sea through the Dardanelles to the Mediterranean. It was quite a sight to witness a Wehrmacht band playing the Internationale as Molotov arrived at the Anhalter Bahnhof, adorned with red Soviet banners. Unfortunately, the meetings did not go well and were marked by mutual frustration. Molotov pressed for clarity on certain issues, including the status of the Nazi-Soviet pact from the previous year. When Hitler confirmed it was still valid, Molotov pointed out that the Germans were forging close ties with the Finns, who were their adversaries. Ribbentrop suggested that the Soviets should move south towards India and the Persian Gulf to share in the riches of the British Empire. However, Molotov dismissed the notion of the Soviet Union joining the tripartite pact with Italy and Japan, and he was not swayed by Hitler's lengthy speech claiming the British were on the verge of defeat. When the air raid sirens blared and Molotov was escorted to the bunker on Wilhelmstrasse, he could not help but ask the Nazi foreign minister, "You claim that England is defeated, so why are we now in this air raid shelter?" The Luftwaffe launched an attack on Coventry the following night, but this had been pre-planned and was not a retaliation. The heavy bombardment targeted 12 munitions factories and destroyed the historic cathedral, claiming the lives of 380 civilians. Yet, the nighttime bombing campaign did not break the resolve of the British people, despite 23,000 civilians killed and 32,000 seriously injured by the year's end. Many expressed frustration with the sirens, which Churchill referred to as prolonged banshee howlings, that were later toned down to allow people a chance to rest. The sirens sounded at roughly the same time each evening, leading to queues forming in poorer districts, as people with blankets, thermos flasks, and infants waited outside air raid shelters. Shuttered shop windows, shattered by bomb blasts, displayed signs saying "business as usual," while residents of houses reduced to rubble in the East End of London placed paper Union Jacks atop the debris that had been their homes. Peter Quennell, working in the Ministry of Information, described the situation by saying the monotony of our days was overshadowed by the grimness of our restless nights. We often had to work in shifts, spending hours in a stuffy underground dormitory under heavy, worn blankets. Above ground, we were perched at our desks, or, during slow moments, dozing on the floor until an elderly office messenger woke us up with some dreadful news, like a direct hit on a crowded bomb shelter. We learned to handle the pain of those realities, noticing how quickly we fall into new routines and how often things we think we need turn out to be unnecessary. Londoners managed to cope with the hardships better than anticipated, showing the spirit of resilience in underground stations. However, a lingering fear of German paratroopers persisted, especially among women outside London. Rumors of an invasion circulated weekly, yet on the 2nd of October, Operation Celian was effectively delayed until the next spring. This operation served a dual purpose. The threat of a German invasion helped Winston Churchill unite the nation and prepare it for a prolonged conflict. Meanwhile, Hitler skillfully kept the psychological threat alive long after he had ruled out the plan, encouraging the British to maintain a much larger defense force in the United Kingdom than was actually needed. In Berlin, Nazi leaders accepted that even extensive bombing would likely fail to subdue Britain. Ernst von Weizsäcker, the state secretary of the German Foreign Office, noted in his diary on the 17th of November that the prevailing belief was that a blockade leading to starvation was the most effective weapon against Britain, rather than attempting to smoke the British out. The term blockade resonated with a sense of revenge in Germany, steeped in memories of the First World War and the Royal Navy's blockade. This approach would now be used against the British Isles through submarine warfare. The fall of France in the summer of 1940 sent shockwaves around the globe. Joseph Stalin was notably unsettled. His expectations that Hitler's power would significantly diminish through a war of attrition against France and Britain were completely mistaken. Germany emerged considerably stronger, having captured a substantial portion of the French army's vehicles and weaponry intact. Further east, the situation posed a significant challenge for Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists. After the loss of Nanking, they moved their industrial activities to the southwestern provinces of Yunnan and Guangxi, near the border of French Indochina, convinced it was the safest place with access to the outside world. However, in July, the new Vichy regime under Marshal Pétain began to yield to Japanese pressures and consented to a Japanese military mission in Hanoi. Consequently, the nationalists' supply route through Indochina was severed. The Japanese 11th Army's advance that summer up the Yangtze Valley fragmented the nationalist forces and inflicted severe casualties. On June 12th, the capture of the significant river port of Yichang was a devastating setback. It further isolated the nationalist capital of Chongqing, allowing Japanese naval aircraft to continuously bombard it. During this time of year, there were no river mists to obscure visibility. Alongside the bombing of towns and villages, Japanese planes targeted steamers and junks packed with wounded soldiers and refugees fleeing upriver through the vast gorges of the Yangtze. Agnes Smedley inquired about the conditions from a Red Cross doctor, who revealed that out of the 150 military hospitals on the Central Front, only 5 remained operational. When Smedley asked about the wounded, he fell silent, and she understood the grim reality. Death pervaded the area. Each day, she noted, bloated corpses of individuals floated down the river, colliding with junks, only to be pushed away by boatmen using long poles. Upon Smedley's arrival in Chongqing, perched high above where the Yangtze and Qiling rivers meet, she was taken aback by the sounds of explosions, which were not from bombs. Chinese engineers were blasting tunnels in the cliffs to create air raid shelters. She discovered that much had transformed during her absence, both positively and negatively. A provincial city bustling with 200,000 residents was rapidly approaching 1 million. The rise of industrial cooperatives was quite promising, yet increasingly influential right-wing factions within the Kuomintang viewed them as veiled communism. Although there were advancements in army medical services, including the establishment of free clinics in nationalist areas, Kuomintang leaders sought control of health services, likely for their own financial benefit. The most alarming development was the ascent of Security Chief General Tai Li, who reportedly commanded a force of 300,000 men, both in uniform and in plain clothes. His authority was so extensive that there were even whispers suggesting he held sway over Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. General Tai was cracking down not only on dissent but also on any form of free expression. As a result, many Chinese intellectuals began to flee to Hong Kong. Even the most benign organizations, like the Young Women's Christian Association, faced closure in this tense climate. Foreigners in Chongqing, according to Smedley, regarded the Chinese armies with disdain. They claimed that China could not fight, its generals were corrupt, its soldiers were illiterate laborers or mere children, and its populace was uninformed. They considered the care of the wounded to be appalling. Some of these accusations were true, others were not, but nearly all stemmed from a failure to comprehend the immense burdens that China was enduring. Europeans and Americans were completely oblivious to the stakes involved and offered little assistance. The significant support for medical services came solely from expatriate Chinese, whether in Malaya, Java, the United States, or other places. Their generosity was remarkable, but in 1941, the Japanese conquerors would make them pay dearly for it. Chiang Kai-shek continued futile peace negotiations, hoping to pressure Joseph Stalin to restore military support to previous levels. However, in July 1940, a shift in the government in Tokyo introduced General Hideki Tojo into the cabinet as the Minister of War. These covert discussions came to an end. Tojo aimed to starve the nationalists of resources by securing a stronger pact with the Soviet Union and cutting off their other supply lines. In Tokyo, military leaders were now focusing their attention southward towards the Pacific and southwest towards the British, French, and Dutch territories around the South China Sea. This strategy would provide them with rice and deprive the nationalist Chinese of imports, but above all, Japan coveted the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The notion of compromising with the United States, particularly involving a withdrawal from China, was unimaginable for the regime in Tokyo after losing 62,000 Japanese soldiers in the China Incident. In the latter half of 1940, the Chinese Communist Party, acting under directives from Moscow, initiated its 100 Regiments campaign in the north, deploying nearly 400,000 men. The goal was to undermine Chiang Kai-shek's discussions with the Japanese, not realizing those talks had already ended and were never truly serious. The Communists successfully pushed back the Japanese in various areas, disrupted the Peking to Hankou Railway, destroyed coal mines, and even launched attacks into Manchuria. This significant effort, employing more traditional military strategies, resulted in 22,000 casualties, which was a heavy toll for them to bear. In Europe, Adolf Hitler showed remarkable loyalty to Benito Mussolini, often leading to the frustration of his generals. However, Mussolini, his former mentor, attempted every tactic possible to avoid being subordinate. He aimed to wage a parallel war independent of Nazi Germany. He failed to inform Hitler about his plan to occupy Albania in April 1939, instead presenting it as a companion action to Germany's takeover of Czechoslovakia. Meanwhile, the Nazi leaders were hesitant to share information with the Italians. Yet, the Germans still sought to sign the Pact of Steel just over a month later. Like careless lovers hoping to benefit from their relationship, both men deceived one another and felt deceived in return. Hitler never alerted Mussolini about his plans to invade Poland, but still expected support against France and Britain. In contrast, Mussolini believed that a major conflict in Europe was unlikely for at least another 2 years. Mussolini's later refusal to join the war alongside Germany in September 1939 greatly disappointed Hitler. The Deuce understood that his country was not prepared and used his demands for military equipment as a justification for his decision. Nevertheless, Mussolini was eager to join the war eventually to expand Italy's colonies and enhance its status as a great power. Consequently, he did not want to miss the chance when the two major colonial powers, Britain and France, faced a significant defeat in early summer 1940. The astonishing speed of Germany's campaign against France, coupled with the widespread belief that Britain would have to negotiate, left him in a state of anxiety. Germany was poised to determine the future of Europe, likely emerging as the dominant force in the Balkans, while Italy risked being relegated to the sidelines. For this reason, Mussolini was desperate to secure a role in peace talks. He believed that a few thousand Italian casualties would earn him a place at the negotiating table. The Nazi regime did not resist Italy's decision to join the war, even at such a late stage. However, Adolf Hitler greatly misjudged Italy's military capabilities. Benito Mussolini had famously boasted about having 8 million bayonets, while in reality, he had fewer than 1.7 million soldiers, many of whom lacked the rifles needed for bayonets. The country was in dire financial straits and suffered from shortages of raw materials and vehicles for transport. To increase the number of divisions, Mussolini reduced the size of each from 3 regiments to 2. Out of 73 divisions, just 19 were fully equipped. In fact, Italy's military was smaller and less armed compared to its forces when it entered the First World War back in 1915. Hitler naively accepted Mussolini's inflated claims about Italian strength. His limited military perspective, influenced by overly optimistic maps at his headquarters, equated any division of troops as a genuine division, regardless of its actual strength, equipment, or training. Mussolini's critical error in the summer of 1940 was believing the war was nearly over, even though it had barely begun. He failed to recognize that Hitler's previous boasts about living space in the East would soon transform into a tangible strategy. On June 10th, Mussolini declared war on Britain and France. In his theatrical speech from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia in Rome, he puffed out his chest and asserted that the young and fertile nations would defeat the exhausted democracies. Though the crowd of devoted black shirts cheered him on, most Italians were far from pleased. The Germans were not swayed by Mussolini's efforts to gain credit from the German armed forces' achievements. The state secretary at Wilhelmstrasse viewed the Axis partner as a circus clown rolling up the carpet after the acrobat's performance and claiming the applause for himself. Many others likened the fascist leader's declaration of war against a defeated France to that of a jackal trying to claim a share of the prey brought down by a lion. The opportunism was blatant, yet it concealed something more detrimental. Mussolini had turned his country into both a captive and a victim of his own ambitions. He realized he could not escape an alliance with the dominant Hitler, yet he clung to the illusion that Italy could follow an independent path of colonial expansion while the rest of Europe faced a far more dangerous conflict. Italy's fragility would ultimately lead to disaster for itself and create significant vulnerabilities for Germany. On September 27, 1940, Germany formalized the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Japan. A key goal was to dissuade the United States from entering the conflict, which had reached a standstill after failing to subdue Britain. When Adolf Hitler met Benito Mussolini at the Brenner Pass on October 4th, he assured him that neither Moscow nor Washington had escalated their reactions to the pact's announcement. Hitler aimed for a unified front against Britain across the continent. He had initially planned for the Mediterranean to remain under Italian control, but soon discovered after France's fall that the situation was more complex. He had to navigate the conflicting interests of Italy, Vichy France, and Francisco Franco's Spain. Franco wanted Gibraltar and was also eyeing French Morocco along with other African territories. However, Hitler was reluctant to upset Philippe Pétain's French state and its loyal forces managing colonial holdings. From his perspective, it was preferable for Vichy France to maintain order in North Africa in Germany's favor for the duration of the war. Once the conflict was resolved, he could allocate France's colonies to either Italy or Spain. Yet, despite his seemingly vast power following France's defeat, Hitler struggled in October to convince Franco, Pétain, or Mussolini to align with his vision for a continental coalition against Britain. On October 22nd, Hitler's armored train, the Führersonderzug Amerika, with its tandem engines and flak wagons, stopped at Montoire-sur-le-Loire station. There he encountered Pierre Laval, Pétain's deputy, who sought assurances regarding the Vichy regime's status. Hitler avoided making any commitments while attempting to secure Vichy's support for a coalition against Britain. The shining carriages of Amerika then proceeded toward the Spanish border at Hendaye, where he met Franco the following day. Delays due to the poor condition of Spanish railways had soured Hitler's mood. The two dictators reviewed a guard of honor from Hitler's personal escort, the Führerbegleitkommando, assembled on the platform. The black uniformed troops stood tall next to the portly Spanish leader, whose expression was a mix of complacency and ingratiation. When Adolf Hitler and Francisco Franco began their talks, Franco dominated the conversation, leaving little room for Hitler to respond, which was unusual for him. Franco reminisced about their shared sacrifices during the Spanish Civil War and expressed his gratitude for Hitler's support, highlighting the spiritual alliance between their nations. He conveyed his deep disappointment at not being able to join the war on Germany's side due to Spain's dire economic state. For much of the 3 hours, Franco meandered through stories of his life and experiences, leading Hitler to remark later that he would rather undergo dental work than endure another discussion with the Spanish leader. Eventually, Hitler interjected, claiming Germany had already secured victory in the war. He explained that Britain was merely hanging on, pinning their hopes on intervention from the Soviet Union or the United States, which would take 1.5 to 2 years to mobilize for conflict. The only real danger from Britain was their potential to occupy Atlantic islands or, aided by Charles de Gaulle, ignite unrest in the French colonies. This was the rationale behind Hitler's desire for a broad front against Britain. Both Hitler and Franco had aspirations for Gibraltar, but Franco and his generals were hesitant to entertain the idea of German command over the operation. Franco also worried that the British might retaliate by capturing the Canary Islands. He was, however, taken aback by the bold German demands for a Canary Island and military bases in Spanish Morocco. Hitler had his sights set on the Portuguese Azores and Cape Verde Islands as well. The Azores held strategic significance as a naval base for the Kriegsmarine. The war diary of the High Command later noted that the Führer valued the Azores for two reasons: as a safety net in case of American intervention and for post-war plans. Hitler envisioned a new breed of bombers capable of reaching 6,000 kilometers to strike the eastern coast of the United States. Franco's expectation for assurances of French Morocco and Oran before even committing to the war struck Hitler as audacious, to say the least. On another occasion, Hitler reportedly expressed Franco's approach made him feel as if he were negotiating with someone trying to bargain for the most sacred of possessions. Upon returning to Germany, he described Franco as a Jesuit swine. Although ideologically aligned with Germany and with a new pro-Nazi foreign minister, Ramon Serrano Suñer, who was eager to enter the war, Franco's government worried about provoking Britain. Spain's survival relied on imports, particularly from Britain, but especially on grain and oil from the United States. After the destruction of its civil war, Spain was in dire straits, and it was not unusual to see people fainting in the streets due to malnutrition. The British, followed by the Americans, skillfully applied economic pressure, knowing that Germany could not compensate for the loss of imports. As it became increasingly evident that Britain was unlikely to negotiate with Germany, Franco's government, already facing severe shortages of food and fuel, could only profess support for the Axis and promise to enter the war at an unspecified time in the future. This did not stop Franco from contemplating his own parallel war, which involved invading Portugal, Britain's traditional ally. Fortunately, this plan never materialized. After the meeting in Hendaye, the special train turned around and returned to Montois, where Marshal Pétain awaited Adolf Hitler. Pétain greeted Hitler as if they were equals, which did not win him any favor with the Führer. The aging marshal hoped for a cooperative relationship with Berlin, but his request for guarantees on France's colonial possessions was harshly dismissed. Hitler reminded him that France had started the war against Germany and would now have to pay for it both territorially and materially. Hitler was less frustrated with Pétain than he had been with Franco, and left the door open for future cooperation. He still desired for Vichy to join an anti-British alliance, but gradually realized he could not rely on the Latin nations to form a continental bloc. Hitler had mixed feelings about a continued strategy against Britain in the Mediterranean, especially since an invasion of southern England seemed unlikely to succeed. His primary focus was on the invasion of the Soviet Union, although he wavered and considered delaying it. By early November, the High Command nonetheless prepared contingency plans under the codename Operation Felix for seizing Gibraltar and the Atlantic Islands. In the fall of 1940, Hitler aimed to isolate Britain and drive the Royal Navy out of the Mediterranean before launching his main plan, invading the Soviet Union. He believed that defeating the Soviet Union would be the key to forcing Britain into submission. This situation frustrated the Kriegsmarine as priority for armaments shifted to the Army and the Air Force. Hitler was willing to support the Italians in their plan to attack British forces in Egypt from their colony in Libya, as this would divert British attention and threaten their communications with India and Australasia. The Italians, while eager for Luftwaffe assistance, were hesitant to allow German ground forces in their operational area, knowing that the Germans would want to dominate entirely. Hitler had a particular interest in the Balkans, viewing them as a strategic base for his invasion of Russia. After the Soviet occupation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, he chose not to disrupt the Nazi-Soviet pact and advised the Romanian government to tolerate the situation temporarily. He decided to send a military mission and troops to Romania to protect the oil fields at Ploiești. One thing Hitler wanted to avoid was Mussolini stirring up the Balkans with an assault on Yugoslavia or Greece from Albania. However, he naively relied on Italian inaction. Initially, it appeared that Mussolini would do very little. The Italian Navy, despite claiming to be aggressive, hardly ventured out except to escort convoys to Libya. Not wanting to confront the Royal Navy, they left the bombing of Malta to the Air Force. In Libya, the Governor-General, Marshal Italo Balbo, refrained from advancing against the British in Egypt, insisting that he would only act when the Germans invaded England. Meanwhile, British forces in Egypt quickly assessed their enemy. On the evening of June 11th, shortly after Mussolini declared war, the 11th Hussars, in their aging Rolls-Royce armored cars, set off towards the west and crossed the Libyan border just after dark. They made their way to Fort Maddalena and Fort Capuzzo, the two primary Italian defense points on the border. While laying ambushes, they captured 70 prisoners. The Italian soldiers were quite distressed, as nobody had informed them that their government had declared war. On June 13th, both forts were taken and destroyed. In a raid 2 days later along the route between Bardia and Tobruk, the 11th Hussars captured another 100 soldiers. Among them was a plump Italian general in a Lancia staff car, accompanied by a heavily pregnant woman who was not his wife. This caused a scandal back in Italy. More significantly for the British, the general possessed all the plans detailing the defenses of Bardia. Marshal Italo Balbo's time in Libya was short. On June 28th, overly eager Italian anti-aircraft batteries in Tobruk mistakenly shot down his plane. Less than a week later, his successor, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, was horrified upon receiving Mussolini's order to advance into Egypt on July 15th, as Mussolini viewed the march on Alexandria as a certainty. Predictably, Graziani sought to delay operations by claiming that an attack was impossible in the summer heat, and later that he lacked adequate equipment. In August, the Duke of Aosta, the Viceroy of Italian East Africa, achieved an effortless victory by moving from Abyssinia into British Somaliland, forcing the limited defenders to retreat across the Gulf to Aden. However, Aosta understood his situation was dire unless Marshal Graziani succeeded in conquering Egypt. Facing the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan and British Kenya to the west, and with the Royal Navy controlling the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, he knew he would receive no supplies until Egypt was captured. Mussolini grew impatient as Graziani continued to hesitate. Finally, on September 13th, the Italians began their advance. They held a clear advantage with 5 divisions against the 3 understrength British and Commonwealth divisions. The 7th Armored Division, known as the Desert Rats, had only 70 operational tanks. The Italians became disoriented even before reaching the Egyptian border. As planned, British forces executed a fighting retreat, eventually surrendering Sidi Barrani, where Graziani halted his progress. Mussolini insisted that they push along the coast road to Mersa Matruh. Yet, with an impending Italian assault on Greece, Graziani's troops did not receive the necessary supplies to proceed. The Germans had repeatedly cautioned Mussolini against an invasion of Greece. On September 19th, Mussolini assured Joachim von Ribbentrop that he would conquer Egypt before launching any attacks on Greece or Yugoslavia. The Italians seemed to agree that the British would be the primary target. On October 8th, Mussolini felt insulted upon learning that German troops were being dispatched to Romania. His foreign secretary, Count Sciano, had overlooked informing him that Ribbentrop had already mentioned it. On October 12th, the Deuce expressed his frustration to Sciano, stating, "Hitler keeps presenting me with completed facts. This time, I will retaliate in kind." The following day, Mussolini instructed the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces to prepare for an immediate invasion of Greece from Italian-occupied Albania. None of his top officers, especially General Sebastiano Visconti Prasca, the commander in Albania, dared to caution the Deuce about the significant challenges of transport and supply for a winter campaign in the mountains of Epirus. The preparations were disorganized. A considerable portion of the Italian military was being demobilized to address the collapse in industrial and agricultural production caused by excessive enlistment when the war began. Units that were short of personnel needed to be reformed. The plan required 20 divisions, but it would take 3 months to transport most of them across the Adriatic Sea. Mussolini aimed to launch the attack on October 26th, less than 2 weeks away. The Germans were aware of these preparations. but they believed that no assault on Greece would occur until the Italians had advanced into Egypt and captured Mursa Matruh. While on his armored train returning from meetings with Francisco Franco and Philippe Pétain, Hitler learned that the invasion of Greece was set to proceed. Instead of continuing on to Berlin, the train was rerouted. Hitler made his way south to Florence, where the German Foreign Ministry had urgently requested a meeting between Mussolini and himself. Early on the morning of October 28th, just before his meeting with Mussolini, Hitler was informed that the Italian invasion of Greece had already commenced. He was enraged. He suspected that Mussolini was envious of German influence in the Balkans and anticipated that the Italians might face unforeseen difficulties. Most importantly, he feared this move would attract British forces to Greece and grant them a bombing base against the oil fields in Romania. Mussolini's reckless actions could even jeopardize Operation Barbarossa. However, by the time the train came to a stop alongside the platform in Florence, where Mussolini awaited him, Hitler had managed to control his anger. During their meeting in the Palazzo Vecchio, the two leaders briefly mentioned the invasion of Greece, primarily focusing on Hitler's proposal to send an air landing division and a parachute division to secure Crete from British occupation. On that day at 3 a.m, the Italian ambassador in Athens delivered an ultimatum to Greek dictator General Ioannis Metaxas, which was set to expire in 3 hours. Metaxas responded with a simple no, but the fascist regime had no regard for his refusal or consent. The invasion commenced just 2.5 hours later, involving 140,000 troops. The Italian soldiers marched into a torrential downpour, but their progress was hindered. The region had experienced 2 solid days of rain, causing streams and rivers to wash away bridges. The Greeks, well aware of the impending attack, which had become an open secret in Rome, destroyed others. Unpaved roads became nearly impassable due to thick mud. The Greeks, uncertain if the Bulgarians would attack from the northeast, had to retain 4 divisions in eastern Macedonia and Thrace. Their defensive line against the Italian advance from Albania stretched from Lake Prespa along the Yugoslav border through the Gramos Mountains and followed the swiftly flowing River Thyamis to the coast opposite the southern tip of Corfu. Lacking tanks and anti-tank guns, and with few modern aircraft, their greatest asset was the widespread outrage of their soldiers, who were determined to defend against the despised invaders. Even the Greek community in Alexandria joined in the patriotic spirit, with about 14,000 individuals sailing to Greece to join the fight, and the funds contributed for the war effort exceeded the entire defense budget of Egypt. The Italians renewed their assault on November 5th, but they only managed to break through along the coast and north of Konitsa, where the Julia division of the Alpini advanced over 20 kilometers. However, this elite unit soon found itself nearly surrounded and managed to escape only partially. General Prasca then ordered his forces to a defensive position along a 140-kilometer front. The Comando Supremo in Rome had to delay their offensive in Egypt and redirect troops to bolster the army in Albania. Mussolini's claim that Italy would conquer Greece in 15 days proved to be empty rhetoric, yet he continued to convince himself of his force's eventual victory. Hitler felt little surprise at the embarrassment of his ally, having anticipated that the Greek soldiers would outshine the Italians. General Alexandros Papagos, head of the Greek General Staff, was mobilizing his own reserves in preparation for a counterattack. Another setback for Italian pride occurred on the night of November 11th, when the Royal Navy struck the naval base at Taranto using Fairey Swordfish aircraft from the carrier HMS Illustrious, along with a squadron of 4 cruisers and 4 destroyers. They successfully hit 3 Italian battleships, the Littorio, the Cavour, and the Duilio, losing only 2 swordfish in the process. The Cavour sank as a result. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, commanding in the Mediterranean, could take comfort that the Italian Navy posed little threat. On November 14th, General Papagos initiated his counteroffensive, confident in his numerical superiority on the Albanian front before Italian reinforcements arrived. His forces, showing remarkable courage and endurance, began to push forward. By the end of the year, the Greeks had driven their attackers back into Albania, retreating between 50 and 70 kilometers from the border. The Italian reinforcements, which increased their army in Albania to 490,000 troops, made little difference. By the time Hitler invaded Greece the following April, the Italians had suffered nearly 40,000 deaths and 114,000 casualties from wounds, sickness, and frostbite. Their claims to great power status had been thoroughly dismantled. The notion of a parallel war was over. Mussolini was no longer considered an ally by Hitler, but had become a subordinate. Italy's long-standing military shortcomings soon became apparent in Egypt as well. General Sir Archibald Wavell, the commander-in-chief for the Middle East, faced a daunting range of responsibilities, spanning North Africa, East Africa, and the Middle East overall. He began with only 36,000 troops in Egypt against 215,000 Italians in their Libyan army. To the south, the Duke of Aosta commanded 250,000 men, many of whom were locally recruited. However, British and Commonwealth forces soon started to arrive in Egypt to support Wavell's command. Wavell, a quiet and thoughtful man with a passion for poetry, did not instill confidence in Churchill. The determined Prime Minister sought commanding officers who would fight fiercely, especially in the Middle East, where the Italians showed signs of vulnerability. Churchill's impatience also played a role. He underestimated the challenges posed by desert warfare, often referred to as the quartermaster's nightmare. Wavell, concerned about the Prime Minister interfering with his plans, did not inform him that he was preparing a counterattack called Operation Compass. He only shared this with Anthony Eden, who was visiting Egypt, when asked to send urgently needed weapons to support the Greeks. Upon learning of Wavell's strategy from Eden's return to London, Churchill claimed to have been very pleased. He promptly urged Wavell to initiate the attack as soon as possible, and certainly within the month. The field commander of the Western Desert Force was Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor. O'Connor was a small but determined man, overseeing the 7th Armored Division and the 4th Indian Division, strategically positioned about 40 kilometers south of the main Italian forces at Sidi Barrani. A smaller unit, Selby Force, took the coastal road from Mersa Matruh to approach Sidi Barrani from the west. Ships of the Royal Navy cruised close to the shoreline, prepared to provide artillery support. O'Connor had already set up concealed supply depots in advance. Given that the Italians had numerous informants in Cairo, including those close to King Farouk, keeping this operation under wraps was challenging. To divert attention, General Wavell, along with his wife and daughters, attended horse races at Gezira just before the engagement. That evening, he hosted a gathering at the Turf Club. When Operation Compass commenced early on December 9th, the British forces achieved total surprise. The Indian Division, led by the Matilda tanks of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, seized the main Italian positions up to the outskirts of Sidi Barrani in less than 36 hours. A detachment from the 7th Armored Division moved northwest, cutting the coast road between Sidi Barrani and Bukbuk, while its main force launched an assault on the Catanzaro Division near Bukbuk. By the end of December 10th, the 4th Indian Division had taken Sidi Barrani, leading to the surrender of 4 Italian divisions in the area the following day. Bukbuk was also taken, and the Catanzaro Division was defeated. Only the Serene Division, located 40 kilometers to the south, managed to escape by retreating rapidly toward the Halfaya Pass. O'Connor's troops had achieved a remarkable victory. They sustained 624 casualties while capturing 38,300 prisoners, 237 guns, and 73 tanks. O'Connor was eager to proceed with the next phase, but he had to pause as most of the 4th Indian Division was reassigned to the Sudan to confront the Duke of Aosta's forces in Abyssinia. In its place, the 16th Australian Infantry Brigade was assigned, leading the way for the 6th Australian Division. The primary target was Bardia, a port located just inside Libya. Following Mussolini's directives, Marshal Graziani positioned 6 divisions around this crucial point. On January 3, 1941, O'Connor's infantry launched their assault, supported by the remaining Matilda tanks. After 3 days of fierce fighting, the Italians surrendered to the Australian 6th Division, resulting in the capture of 45,000 soldiers, 462 field guns, and 129 tanks. General Annibale Bergonzoli, often referred to as Electric Whiskers due to his distinctive facial hair, managed to flee towards the west. The attackers only sustained 130 deaths and 326 injuries. Meanwhile, the 7th Armored Division advanced rapidly to encircle Tobruk. Two Australian brigades swiftly followed from Bardia to finalize the siege. Tobruk eventually capitulated, yielding an additional 25,000 prisoners, 208 artillery pieces, 87 armored vehicles, and 14 Italian army prostitutes, who were sent back to a convent in Alexandria, where they remained in hardship for the remainder of the conflict. O'Connor was appalled to learn that Winston Churchill's proposal to Greece included both ground troops and aircraft, jeopardizing the continuation of his offensive. Fortunately, Metaxas declined the offer, believing that anything less than 9 divisions would provoke the Germans without providing a realistic chance of defense. Meanwhile, the disintegration of the Italian Empire persisted in East Africa. On January 19th, with the 4th Indian Division poised in Sudan, Major General William Platt's forces moved against the disjointed army of the Duke of Aosta in Abyssinia. 2 days later, Emperor Haile Selassie returned to aid in the liberation of his nation, accompanied by Major Orde Wingate. In the south, a force led by Major General Alan Cunningham, who was the younger brother of the admiral, launched an attack from Kenya. Aosta's army, weakened by a lack of resources, could not hold out for long. In Libya, O'Connor opted to push hard to ensnare the majority of the Italian forces in the coastal area of Cyrenaica by directing the 7th Armored Division straight through to the Gulf of Sirte, south of Benghazi. However, many tanks were inoperable, and the supply situation was dire, with communication lines stretching over 1,300 kilometers back to Cairo. Thus, O'Connor commanded the division to pause in front of a fortified Italian position at Mekili, south of the Jebel Akhdar Massif. Armored car patrols and Royal Air Force aircraft soon detected signs of a significant retreat. Marshal Graziani was initiating the evacuation of all of Cyrenaica. On February 4th, the race known as the Benghazi Handicap kicked off in earnest. The 11th Hussars led the 7th Armored Division as they navigated the challenging terrain to intercept the remnants of the Italian 10th Army before they could flee. The 6th Australian Division followed the retreating forces along the coast and entered Benghazi on February 6th. Upon learning of the Italian evacuation from Benghazi, Major General Michael Krieg of the 7th Armored Division dispatched a flying column to cut them off at Bet Afam. This force, comprising the 11th Hussars, the 2nd Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, and 3 batteries of the Royal Horse Artillery, arrived at the road just in time. Confronted by 20,000 Italians eager to escape, they feared being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But just as it seemed they would be surrounded on the landward side, the light tanks of the 7th Hussars charged the left flank of the Italian formation, creating panic and confusion. The fighting subsided only with the setting sun. The battle resumed at dawn as more Italian tanks joined the fray. However, the British flying column also began to receive reinforcements as additional squadrons from the 7th Armored Division arrived. Over 80 Italian tanks were destroyed in their attempts to break through. Meanwhile, the Australians advancing from Benghazi added to the pressure from the rear. After a final escape attempt failed on the morning of February 7th, General Bergonzoli surrendered to Lieutenant Colonel John Combe of the 11th Hussars. Electric Whiskers was the highest-ranking surviving officer of the 10th Army. Exhausted and dejected, Italian soldiers sat in groups, huddled under the rain as far as the eye could see. One of Combes' junior officers, when asked over the radio how many prisoners the 11th Hussars had captured, reportedly responded with casual confidence, "Oh, several acres, I would think." 5 days later, General Lieutenant Erwin Rommel landed in Tripoli, accompanied by the initial elements of what would be known as the Afrika Korps.